And so many secrets, I think, are being held by people in the church, maybe like the meeting you're talking about, where there are sweet mothers who are, who are at their church every week, who are the most faithful givers and prayers and casserole makers, but their son is gay and they feel like they can't talk about it and they can't bring it up, or they couldn't bring him around, or they're unsure if he came home at Christmas, if he would be welcome at the service. And those are the stories that break my heart as a pastor, because that is not only pain for the person who identifies as gay, but it's also pain for that mother and that system, and knowing that the church is not a place where this family feels like they can bring their whole selves to church. And so I think what I'm asking is for us to have just some deeper conversations about the human story.
Welcome to Great Bible Teacher Interviews. Hello, I'm Rick Jordan, President of Great Bible Teachers. Regularly, I take the opportunity to interview authors, professors, and practitioners to talk about the Bible, the biblical interpretation, or the spiritual formation of the person. This is all in the context of those who lead small groups, Bible studies, spiritual formation groups, to help us learn more about the way people grow spiritually. Today, I'm very pleased to bring to you the interview that I had with Elizabeth Hagan. I got to know Elizabeth about 16 years ago or so when she was a student at Duke University at the Divinity School. She, since then, has graduated and ministered at several different places, recently in Washington, D.C., in that area. As a pastor, as associate pastor, she is now the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Our Courageous Kids. This is a foundation serving young adults who grew up in international orphanages with educational and mental health support. She has also just been asked to be interim senior pastor at First Christian Church of Athens, Georgia. Elizabeth has written a book called Brave Church, Tackling Tough Topics Together, published by Upper Room Books, and that's going to be the basis of our conversation today. She has her summary thesis later in the book on page 103. I want to quote this for you. She says, "As Christians, we are called to tear down the barriers between us, to choose unlikely conversation partners, and to listen with open hearts to the stories of all the people we encounter." I know you'll enjoy this interview with Elizabeth Hagan. You can find out more about her at elizabethhagan.com. Elizabeth, welcome to Great Bible Teachers. I'm so glad that you can join us today and that I get a chance to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. The first question I always ask the people I interview is, because we are great Bible teachers, who has been a great Bible teacher in your life, and why would you say that about them?
Well, I was really excited to answer that question because it tells you a little bit more about my book, Brave Church, that I'm here to talk with you about today.
Mm-hmm.
So in Brave Church, the dedication page is to Beth, who taught me the joy of diligent study and abides with me in tough conversations. Beth was my Bible teacher in high school. I went to a Christian school in high school where we had to take Bible classes in 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, and she was my teacher for 3 of those years. It was a conservative Presbyterian school, but I don't know how in the world they let her teach Bible, but they did, and she was amazing. And it was, one of the first times I was exposed to such a strong woman in a teaching role that had such a love of scripture and such a love of abiding and hard conversations as they, went on in our high school. And the cool part about my relationship with this teacher is that her husband actually ran a youth camp organization that I called Sun Servants, that I worked at for a summer in college and continued to volunteer with. And so that was a connection we had post high school. And then when I was senior minister at Washington Plaza Baptist Church in Reston, I invited Beth to come and be a teacher at one of our education seminars. And we reconnected as adults, and we've been really great friends ever since. And so she's a person in my life that maybe we don't always agree theologically on how to interpret text, but I do know that she is a deeply studied person and a woman of prayer and a woman of wanting to consider new opinions. And so even when we have disagreements about where we land, I always know that it's a safe place for me to have conversations. And so when I was thinking about who to dedicate Brave Church Tackling Tough Topics together to, I could think of really no better person than my friend Beth. Because I really do hope that we all have people like that in our life. And I know that it's rare that happens, but people who go the journey with us and maybe are not people that, we have to agree on everything, but we have long-term relationships of study and learning with.
Oh, I love that. That is great. And it does fit so well into the.
I know.
Yeah. So, were you, I guess this may help you to define Brave Church with a yes or no kind of question. Were you raised in a Brave Church, or what gave you the idea that other churches need to look at this idea of being brave?
I was not raised in a Brave Church. I think I was raised in a scripturally literate church. I was raised in a church with lots of caring, loving people who were just all trying to do their best to love God and serve their neighbors. But as far as bravery, I think the seeds of writing a book like Brave Church was planted in me from my childhood. The church I attended, I always noticed, especially when I was growing up in middle and high school, that there were things that we didn't talk about. Like there would be ministers who would just disappear because of something. Or there would be a girl in the youth group who went away to a hospital for treatment because of an eating disorder, and we never talked about it. Or there would be someone for whom spouse would never come to church, and we kind of knew that maybe it had something to do with depression, but nobody would ever say the reasons. Mm-hmm. And I always felt, and I still feel, just frustrated by that it was somehow like, are we embarrassed? Are we ashamed? Why can't we talk about these things that are going on in these lives of people that we love? And I always believed that the church could do better. And when people ask me, why did I become a pastor, which we share Baptist roots, you and I, that the journey, if you're a woman called to be a pastor, is not one that's an easy road. But I felt very committed to the path because I wanted the church to be more authentic. And I wanted the church to be a place, unlike my childhood church, where I could bring my whole self to the congregation, and that there wouldn't have to be so much hush hush, let's not talk about this when things happened, that people would think about a congregation as brave and that they talked about real life in that place.
Yeah. And okay, so I've got to tell you, I love your book.
Well, thank you.
Like it seems like everybody I talk to, I'm just saying, what you need is to read Elizabeth Hagan's book.
Well, thank you for the commercials. I appreciate it.
And one of the things I really like is you kind of give distinctions between like a safe church conversation and a brave church conversation. Like there are these kind of unwritten rules that you have now written.
Yes.
That, But can you share some about that, like the rules that we have, and what's the difference between a safe conversation and a brave conversation?
If you think about churches as they were created from the time of the early church until now, people gathered in small communities because it was a safe place, right?
Mhm.
We say that a church is a place where we share beliefs, we share vision for life, we share connection to God in a particular way that we're forming our life together. And these things are very important to how we come together. But in doing that, for a community to feel safe, um, there's things that happen where we want to silence an opinion that's not the majority opinion, or if there's disagreements. If we're living in this, oh, it's so safe, it's so comforting, it's so welcoming to the most number of people, what happens is folks easily get left out and experiences don't get told, and people don't have a space to agree to disagree. I mean, that's what they do. We say, well, let's agree to disagree, and in that, nobody actually talks about anything.
Mm.
And I encountered several years ago a study that was done at New York University, I write about in the book, that was done by some college educators who were really concerned about how social justice conversations in their context were not moving, especially around the topic of racism. And what they found is, in colleges, it's quite commonplace, much like churches, where people gather. There's the student union for women, there's a student union for the Latino students, there's a student union, for all the different types of groups, right? And we kind of stay separate. And so in the study, they found that there needed to be some intentionality around people getting together if it was going to move from just being a comfortable place to a safe place. And they created a series of 5 rules. And I read those and thought, wow, this is so cool. Like, this could be adapted in a faith context. And what if we had small groups that formed their conversations in this way? And so, if I'd love to tell you about what those are.
Yeah, yeah, because
Yeah.
I think this is, to me, well, before we get into that, let me ask you, it seems to me what you're saying is safety is important. It's important
Yes,
to
of course, it is important.
sanctuary. We call it a sanctuary.
Right.
And so it's important to have sanctuary, but if that is the ultimate goal, then we miss out on real relationships with people and learning things about God and how God is helping people through troubles. And so safety is good, and it's an important core value for church in a way, but safety should not be like all we're about.
Correct. You got it. Yeah. We all need safe spaces. And for many of us, our home, for example, is a safe space where we retreat to and get rest and find belonging. Some people it's not, which is a whole other conversation. But we need safe spaces in our life, but we also need brave spaces where we're able to be folks who actually live into our values of being more inclusive and hearing more stories and running toward those people for who have experienced pain in their life and who naturally are going to feel left out in our safe ways of being, because there's not room for their stories to be
Mm,
heard and for them to feel like that they belong.
mhm.
And so, for example, I already kind of mentioned this, instead of just saying, well, let's just agree to disagree and not talk about this, that we're going to accept one of the first brave space rules is to accept conflict as part of the process. And I know that you know a lot about that because you've worked with churches, right? And conflict
Right.
through the years. And we have this idea that conflict is bad, that conflict destroys, conflict is terrible. And not to say that conflict can't be painful, but conflict can be a great tool of learning, when we are able to understand that, hey, just because I worship with this person and maybe I've been in the pew with them for the past 20 years, maybe I don't know them at all because they've had this experience where they haven't felt like they can bring it to the table. And so the first brave space rule says we will accept conflict and commit to the way of kindness. Kindness being a really key word in that. Or, you've heard it said, well, just don't take things too personally. I mean, I've been in deacons meetings, right, where it's like, well, I'm going to tell you what I think, but don't take this personally. That silences people, right? And so a brave church would have the intention of taking responsibility for how our words are received. Even if we didn't intend them to be hurtful or intend them to cause pain to someone else, if someone has experienced our actions or our words as painful, we take responsibility for that. I grew up in a church that said, just keep quiet, especially to the youth, like you can come to church, don't participate, but please just be quiet. Maybe you need to listen to the elders and, let them do their thing. Don't ruffle any feathers. I think there's so many groups that we like to silence in churches by this kind of unspoken rule of keeping quiet. But in brave space, we want all those voices to be heard. And we are actually going to go through a process where we might ask permission to challenge someone's views on a subject. So if you and I were talking and you said something that I was like, oh, I don't know, or vice versa, I would ask you, I'd say, Rick, could I challenge you on this? Or could I share a story that may offer a different perspective? Now, I ask permission to do that because sometimes we're just not in a space to receive a challenge, like we're having something's really tender to us. We've had a hard day. We got to run out to a meeting. We don't have time for a longer conversation. We ask permission, but we challenge one another. What?
I just had a flashback of a conversation I had with a good friend. She and I were walking. This is like in a retreat setting. And we were walking around and she said, do you know what's wrong with you? And it was like you said, I kind of had to stop and do an inner check and say, am I ready to hear what's wrong with me?
Right.
But it was kind of her to ask it, before she just laid it out on me.
Right.
It's like, okay, yeah, I'm feeling okay. I can take it. So
yeah,
what's wrong with me?
No, and I've had that experience with my friends my friends of color, who, if we're in a context where I'm talking about something and I may not know that I'm being offensive and the things that I'm saying, and they'll come to me and say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but could I challenge you on this point? Or could I offer you a different perspective? And there have been times where that's happened to me and I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't, like you feel so terrible that that you did something that was hurtful. But I'm so thankful for those who have done that for me. And so the fourth area, we always just say, I think a general rule of any small group is like, just respect everyone, but we don't ever talk about what that means. And so it doesn't end up being very brave. So in a brave space, that we would show respect for one another and graciously receive feedback if someone feels disrespected, that we're going to understand that respect for you is not going to be the same as respect for me. I was doing a joint Bible study worship service kind of experience with an African-American church one time where we were kind of sister churches and we did all these activities together. And we were planning a joint service and I was in charge of doing the bulletin. And I am pretty informal in my pastoral ministry. You call me Elizabeth, it's fine. In the bulletin, it just says Elizabeth Hagan or Elizabeth Evans Hagan, whatever it happens to be. And so I was doing the bulletin and my clergy colleague, who was African-American, had her doctorate. She saw my draft and she was like, this is all wrong. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Did I spell your name wrong? Like, what's going on? And she said, well, in our tradition, we've been so disrespected by so many folks. And we use titles at our church. So everyone in the bulletin coming from our church needs to be, Reverend Doctor. If that's, for her, it needed to be trustee, deacon, sister, brother. They all had to have titles. And, in my case, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I was giving them the same respect that I was living with my congregation. But it was a learning moment of realizing that respect looked differently. in our context, and therefore our behavior, my behavior needed to change.
It's a great illustration. Yeah.
Yeah. And the fifth brave space rule is, instead of just saying a blanket statement of like, let's just not attack each other, which of course it's hard to know even what that means. I don't know. I've been to so many, or heard of so many, church brawls in the parking lot after some meeting, and people are, going at each other. But this is just kind of a basic thing, that we will use I statements instead of you statements, that we will, approach in bravery, we approach it from my perspective of how what you've said has affected me, how it's made me feel, and how then I can relate to the group as a result of that. And so my hope is for people that take on, say, the Brave Church study, that the first week that they would meet together, that they would covenant to these intentions, and that they would go back to them throughout the study, that it's really important because it's a different way of being together. And that they would say, in the space that we're doing Brave Church together, we're going to practice this and see how it might alter our conversations with one another. In 2019, when I was writing Brave Church, I piloted this at my congregation, Palisades Community Church in Washington, D.C. And what was fascinating to me is that we had a chart, with the rules up, and we had to keep going back to it. And we all did. I mean, we all got confused or forgot. We had to practice it. I think brave is a muscle that you have to really work at. And it was really interesting to hear people for whom I hadn't heard them speak up in group conversation before, to talk about their experiences of, say, they had been through domestic violence and we had never known, or that they had experienced racism as growing up in a mixed race household and we never knew about it. And to hear people begin to do that challenge thing where they would call each other out and say, when we had that council meeting and you said this, that was a really sexist remark. And could you, let me explain to you how I felt. It was cool to see how it shaped our life together. It starts really small, but it can grow to really alter the way that you have relationships in community, which was so cool to see for me.
Yeah. What would you say first step to begin doing the Brave Church conversion of a church?
Sure. Well, I had someone who I recently talked to about this book said, I really like it, that it's not Brave Pastor, it's Brave Church. It's not about one person doing something. It's about the fact that we all need to be a part of this movement, that when you show up and you tell a vulnerable story, and I show up and I tell a vulnerable story, that we somehow feel, and we feel more connected, and we need all of the stories to be a part to have our church feel more brave. But I will say this, with that caveat, I think it does start with the leaders, a leader to say that this is important enough that we're going to talk about it. And as well as I do, that it's really hard for leaders to be brave, even if they want to be, and even if they are in another part of their life, because as pastors, when our income is dictated by a congregation, we're afraid sometimes if we preach that sermon or we say that thing, then we're not going to have a job next week. I had a mentor say to me once, I'm one business meeting away from not having a job anymore, right? But I think even that's what makes it brave, to stand up and to begin to talk about things. And I don't think you approach it from a political sense of like, picking a party or position. But I think if you begin talking about things that have happened to you in a real way, that is something that people really gravitate toward, and it inspires them to share more. In the mental illness chapter, I share a study that was done by Lifeway Research that surveyed over 1,000 pastors. And they said in that study that I believe it was close to 98% of pastors felt like someone in their congregation was struggling with mental illness. That's a lot.
Yeah.
but only 12% of them said that they'd ever preached or talked about the topic openly. And I remember the day I found that statistic, and I just kind of sat and stared at the book for a really long time because, as someone who went through a long series of medical struggles with infertility and the depression that came as a result of that, I mean, I've found that that's something I need to talk about, that I need to say, I have been depressed. I've had medical intervention for depression. And, it opens up conversations within people more willing to tell me, about their story. We have to be honest as leaders. And that's my commercial for that. But, as far as doing Brave Church, I think it's it's best when you do it in a small group, where you get a intentional gathering of 6, 8, 10 people, and you say for the next 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, up to 7 weeks, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to study this. We're going to set this time aside that's different from even our normal Sunday school class or our normal, group, whatever it looks like, and we're going to learn how to relate to each other in a different way. In each of the topics that I address in Brave Church, infertility and miscarriage, mental illness, domestic violence, racism, and sexuality. There's so much more that work you can do on those topics. It's just a real beginning. But I think that beautiful things happen when you just tiptoe in to the conversation and say the words out loud and allow space for stories to come out that maybe you've never heard. And then, figure out where you are at the end of that study. And maybe you say, hey, we really need to go deeper into racism. Or, hey, maybe God is calling us as a church to address this mental illness crisis of whatever it looks like in your community. And you go deeper in that way. I saw it happen in my church where we did this, and then I had people wanting to celebrate Domestic Violence Awareness Month with like posters in the bathrooms of statistics and helplines, and we all wore ribbons, and we had a crisis shelter speaker come in, and I didn't do any of that. I mean, I would have loved if that I could brag and say, oh, yeah, I have made that happen, but it was my people saying, okay, this is a big deal. We need to do something, and it was really brave and awesome to see.
Yeah, and it seems to me that even if it were, 8 to 10 people who are having this conversation, and they are exercising those brave muscles, as you say,
right?
When they do go back to their Bible study group or the deacons meeting or whatever area of responsibility that they have, they've now grown in strength to be able to do a brave conversation themselves, maybe to help other people with it. So it seems like,
yeah, absolutely, that you begin to think differently, and maybe you can lead, when there's a heated moment in a discussion about something, or, you're a little more aware to notice how someone's being quiet and not being heard, that you want to use your privilege to bring their voices up to the surface. Yeah.
So the infertility, that was the subject of your first book.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so maybe give us kind of a case study of that, as far as like, what is it that we need to be a brave church when it comes to that particular subject? Well,
I'm really glad that the statistics resonated with you and you kind of saw the bigger picture of the topic. And the statistics tell us that 1 in 8 couples are struggling with infertility right now. And so that means it is present in every church in America. 10 to 15% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. It's a huge deal. It's such a painful loss for women and men who go through that and they're trying to build their family. And I think there's this misconception about those two topics, that it's something, well, if you have young people in your church, that's a problem for them. That's one thing that I found when I was talking about my first book. Like, people said, well, I'm not sure, we have a lot of old people, we don't want to talk about this topic. But what we don't realize is that it's one of those things that sticks. It's a pain that sticks with people for life. And I can't tell you how many people came up to me when I was talking a lot about infertility and miscarriage with my own story, who were in their 60s or 70s and telling me these really painful stories about how they always wanted to have children and they never could, or they had these failed adoptions, or even I heard a story of a woman who went through IVF, one of the first IVF patients in America. And she felt like, I can't bring this to my church. If people know that my child was conceived in this way, they're going to think that he's weird, or that ask me all these strange questions. And so I think we have to make space for unprocessed pain, and knowing that we haven't talked about it. It is changing in our culture, I think, but the church needs to lead the way in defining family greater than just biological family. Because isn't that what, I mean, that's something I hope that I'm going to write about a whole lot more in the future. I'm an adopted mother now. I have adopted kids, not legally, from a foundation that I run in Kenya, who are a dear part of our family. And I think, I grew up singing the song, I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. I think we sang that like every Sunday night, when we did the meet and greet and stuff. But do we really mean that? Or are we just talking about biological children that come naturally, to families in our midst? There's some beautiful community work that we can do when we are more inclusive of what we mean when we talk about family, and knowing that the cultural holidays of Mother's Day and Father's Day can be extremely painful for those not only who have lost their parents, but those who have wanted to have children in their families and either have found that to be difficult or have lost them. And I offer some suggestions and some liturgies in the book about how to redefine those days, and how to approach them with sensitivity to those who are struggling.
There are other subjects that are kind of like, it's a taboo, like
Yeah.
we just aren't going to talk about that. And
Right.
So like, I don't want to give short shrift to other things that you talked about, but I do want to include in this conversation at least one taboo subject. And so like the sexuality is an area that, again, I was in a meeting last night with 11 people, and I had to talk about this little book a little bit and say, because we were talking about how can our church have authentic relationships. And so someone, not me, but someone else did bring up the subject of sexuality and said, they had some relatives who were gay, and everyone in the room shook their head. It was like, because she said, like, do any of you all have family members who are gay? And everybody shook their head. It's like, and then one of the youngest person in the group said, and yet we never talk about it.
Yeah.
So it's like a taboo subject.
Yeah.
Talk about this subject.
Yeah.
So something that is as socially and religiously kind of got a lot of baggage to it. How can we be brave in our conversations about that kind of subject?
Well, that chapter, I knew it would be hard to put together, but I knew I couldn't write a book about being brave without talking about human sexuality, right? Because it's the issue that has divided denominations. I mean, you could almost look at the spectrum of Protestant Christianity, and everybody's got their story of division or upcoming division. The release of this book was supposed to be timed around the United Methodist conversations around human sexuality, which have been delayed because of COVID, but it's a very big deal, and how our communities are formed. But I think that the whole book, and I just want to say, is not written from the perspective of this is what, and I hope that you got this from reading it, not from the perspective of this is what Elizabeth thinks, so you need to do this, but more so opening up the conversation and making space for people for whom have different experiences or ideas about something. But for me, what always gets me when it comes to stories about sexuality and why we don't talk about them in the church, goes back to the humanity of people for whom identify as gay or lesbian or transgender, bisexual, whatever it may be, because their humanity, even if you say you think their choices are wrong, we somehow don't treat them with full respect or love or compassion. And so many secrets, I think, are being held by people in the church, maybe like the meeting you're talking about, where there are sweet mothers who are, who are at their church every week, who are the most faithful givers and prayers and casserole makers, but their son is gay and they feel like they can't talk about it and they can't bring it up, or they couldn't bring him around, or they're unsure if he came home at Christmas, if he would be welcome at the service. And those are the stories that break my heart as a pastor, because that is not only pain for the person who identifies as gay, but it's also pain for that mother and that system, and knowing that the church is not a place where this family feels like they can bring their whole selves to church. And so I think what I'm asking is for us to have just some deeper conversations about the human story and how it rubs up against our theology, and finding ways to talk about it. I think good things happen. Going back to, we will accept conflict. Good things happen when we bring things up and we're able to say, you know what, this is in my family. I love someone, and I wish they felt more welcome, in our church.
Yeah, right. The last or another subject that you talk about that is very current as well, and is very upfront and in our face all the time, I think, is the racism. So it is the racism issue is something that that's a black-white racism. There's other kinds. Asian population is speaking out more freely about how they have experienced racism. So racism is another issue. Talk to us about that a little bit, about being a brave church when it comes to the racism issue.
Well, we have to talk about it. It always goes back to that. We have to mention it in our histories. One of the things I encourage people to do is to examine their church history and how it was formed. There's so many stories just within those sheer facts. Churches that were started in response to racism, churches that moved across town, right, with the white flight in the 1960s because of racism. I think powerful things happen when we name and claim our heritage and begin to speak of it. And we begin to call out our own stories and our own bias. I write about in that chapter my own experience of realizing race as a child, growing up in a predominantly white community and having friends of color in elementary school, and finding myself conflicted over my relationships with them and what that meant, and being taught yet in church, songs like Jesus Loves All the Little Children, and this sense of like, we love everyone, but what does it actually look like, and thinking about how segregated our congregations are, and having innovative ways to begin to have conversations. I feature in every chapter of Brave Church 2 examples of some congregations that are doing something innovative. And I really love what Broadneck Baptist Church in Annapolis, Maryland is doing. They started these monthly race conversations, which I keep up with them. I know they're still doing them. They did their first kind of protest around the anniversary of the massacre at the church in Charleston. And they found themselves beginning to name racism and to interact with their community around that topic, and just by having a conversation every month and putting it on the calendar, and not saying we're going to do it because it's Black History Month, or we're not doing it because it's Juneteenth, or whatever it might be, that's just a part of their rhythm of their life together, is to talk about race. And I'm so thankful for that story.
Yeah, that is a great thing you've got in your book, is some really good illustrations. Not that these are the prescriptions that every...
No, absolutely not.
But
yeah.
like here's an example of what's happened once these conversations have actually happened, and then the church decides we need to do something besides talk, now that we know.
Right, that it, and I hope that the examples, they're contextual, right? Because I think all conversations about these issues go back to your context and where are the people coming from? What is your neighborhood like? Like any good ministry, there's no one size fits answers to anything.
Mhm.
But I hope that the examples really encourage people to imagine and to dream again about what it could look like, and to know that it's, these are just, average, they didn't receive some grant for some big study, or, they don't have 10 church consultants. They're just ordinary people doing life together, and have found a way to open up their dialogue with people who have experienced pain as a result of feeling left out.
Yeah.
And if I think about my ministry and the types of churches I pastored, and the things that I've been able to do in the nonprofit space with my husband in particular, I think that my calling has always been to be a branch of helping those who have felt left out or felt unwelcome to know that they belong, and that they're seen, and that they're heard, and that God loves them just as they are. And that to do that we have to have an open heart, right? Like, this, we think it starts with our mind, but I don't believe that's true. I think it starts with our heart. Are we going to enter in to new relationships with new friends, or with old friends, with an open heart? And if we are, like, cool things can happen. We can have our heart be turned and be made tender toward those for whom we've experienced difficult things.
Yeah.
And then, our theology comes later, right? But start with your heart.
Yeah.
and be a human being that has compassion toward those who have struggled.
You in your, I guess it's last chapter, next to last chapter, you call it "Let's Keep Talking," and in there you talk about the biblical story of Peter and Cornelius in chapter 10, and how here Peter is pretty settled in his theology and his beliefs and his purity. He's pretty feeling pretty good about himself and who he is and his place in the world and with God, I think. And then God kind of just crashes in with a vision and says, don't call unclean what I've called clean. And then Cornelius shows up at his door. And I mean, it really fits in with this, that that to be brave, I guess, to me means to have the courage to say, I could be wrong.
Correct.
Maybe all this I've always believed, and I know what I think the Bible says about it, just like Peter did. God may be trying to tell me something new and different, and am I brave enough to take a step toward the door of somebody knocking on it that I don't know, and it's a different kind of person.
Right. Absolutely. And I think you could put the story of Jonah in that category, like he didn't want to go to Nineveh to preach to these people, these are not the people that God interacts with, Jonah kept saying, with his life. But I think that the stories of scripture always, draw us back toward having our vision expanded.
Yeah.
And I've loved preaching on that Peter text. It comes up in the lectionary, I think almost, every little Easter season. And if you think about what it means to be people of the resurrection, that new life, we say new life is always coming. That the resurrection it was an event, but it continues to happen. That if we're followers of Jesus, we believe that new life is always here. And I think new life happens in our human relationships with each other as we feel open to how God leads us to befriend, to learn, to grow in new ways. That's resurrection.
Yeah. Wow. We're resurrection people. So
we are. So we might as well start being brave, knowing we're going to mess up and we're going to say wrong things. We're going to have to apologize. We're going to have to learn what respect means again for other people. But I mean, I've found, and those, new hard relationships for myself. I mean, um, and people are just so happy that you showed up, you know, and there's a lot of grace that's often extended. It's like going to a new country, right? And you think you can't speak the language, but you're really going to try. You would have taken the class, you got your translator, and people, you go in a shop and you're like fumbling through your French or whatever, but you're trying, and there's so much respect that happens because you're trying. And I think people respond to bravery, even if we're fumbling. We don't have to get it right.
Mhm.
It's a big deal. I think that brave conversation, just talking like we're doing, talking directly to
Yeah.
another person, not texting, not sending an email, not leaving a pamphlet,
Right.
of your beliefs. They open more doors than we ever think are possible.
So I love this quote, or it's something I'm going to read from your book. You say, I don't know anyone who wakes up and thinks, I want to talk with someone who adamantly disagrees with me today. That sounds fun.
Yeah. Yeah,
However, I hope we've all discovered during this study that these difficult conversations are so important.
it's true.
Yeah. So this is not a book about how to be more comfortable in your world or your church. It's a book about how to be uncomfortable. Uh, Again, your image of the muscles. If you're exercising muscles, if there's no burn, there's no growth going on.
Right. Right. And I hope that what I've done, like I have a preschool daughter, and we have, rules in our house of like, when we go to bed and we don't drink juice at night, all the silly things. We eat our food at the table and we don't put the crumbs everywhere, and these rules are a sense of like parameters around, how we happily live together as a family. And rules for kids are a sense of safety, and that they provide a framework that helps them know what's expected and help them move forward in their lives. And I hope with Brave Church, I'm giving you a framework so that, yeah, it is scary, and yeah, it's hard, but you have a sense of being held.
Mhm.
You're held by this covenant that I hope that a group would make to each other, that they're gonna, this is not a free for all screaming match, everybody share their views kind of conversation, that you're being held and undergirded by these brave church rules that will help you be able to actually hear and listen to each other.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, is there any question I should have asked that I didn't ask?
Well, no, but I want to tell you about something that I'm excited about, that maybe some folks that listen to this would be interested in, or even folks, you can help me spread the word. But I am in the process of recruiting churches who will be a part of my Brave Church cohort starting this fall, who will commit to doing, getting a small group together, at least one, and doing this study. And as part of that commitment, I'm going to be involved if they would like, a resource to the leader, happy to Zoom into their meetings or visit in person if that's possible. And hope that this becomes a thing. As I saw it with my own church, it really was so powerful for us. And I hope that some churches will join me soon, whether it be this fall or maybe even next Lent. I hope to do another cohort then. It's a great time to not just study, the 7 last words of Jesus or the 7 deadly sins, but to do something deeper in discipleship as a community. So if that appeals to anyone listening, feel free to get in touch with me at elizabethhagan.com, and be glad to chat with you.